Hello and a very warm welcome. My name is Dave Litton from the Projex Academy, and this is our Earned Schedule Primer. Now, the technique of earned schedule has become more and more popular since it was introduced way back in 2003, and its success and importance is reflected in the fact that it now forms part of the 2018 Project Management Institute's official PMBOK syllabus. So whether you are preparing to become a project management professional by passing PMI's exam, or simply whether you are a practicing project manager wanting your projects to be as successful as they can, then you really need to come up to speed with the earned schedule technique. And I've developed our primer to do just that. So let's you and I start at the very beginning. You see, put as simply as I can, there are four main techniques used when planning and delivering a typical project. One of them, of course, is Earned Value Management, or EVM, as this really has become a benchmark in providing the proper control for any particular project. There's also, of course, Critical Path Management, and this, of course, is used during planning to create a realistic plan. Also fairly new is the Critical Chain Management method, and this would be used during planning as well as delivery. And then, of course, is Earned Schedule Management, which is what this primer is all about. Now, be aware, it's only Critical Path and Critical Chain that are used solely for planning, although, of course, they'll also be used for execution and monitoring and control of your project. When it comes to Earned Value Management and Earned Schedule Management, however, these only need to get used during the executing, monitoring and controlling stages or phases of your project. However, all four will play an important part within the monitoring and controlling of your project. Now, Earned Value and Critical Path are mature and well understood techniques. Critical Chain is not yet well known, and many project managers and organisations don't yet use its power. And despite Earned Schedule being created way back in 2003, it's only just being recognised. So one of the main objectives of our Earned Schedule primer is to bring everyone up to speed on how to apply these important and vital techniques. What you may not be aware of is that Earned Value metrics can become unstable once a project is around 2/3 complete. And for this reason, schedule variance analysis needs to be performed to complement the result of the Earned Value Management schedule variance and performance metrics. Let me put that another way. You will still be wanting to use Earned Value Management. Be quite clear on that front. However, as you're about to learn, Earned Value Management, in particular the metrics that are used, are all cost-based, depending on whichever currency you're using, of course. And although Earned Value metrics include schedule elements, they are, if you will, transformed from cost into schedule data, and therefore they are not truly representing important schedule data. So it's important that you do not rely solely on EVM scheduling metrics to assess the project status, and you will always want to analyse the Earned Value Management scheduling metrics in conjunction with Earned Schedule and Critical Path schedule analysis. I dare say as a practicing project manager you'll be familiar with Critical Path analysis and adjusting the schedule to meet key dates during planning. By the same token, once the project is underway and actual results do not line up directly with the plan, then yet again you would use Earned Value and Earned Schedule in concert with Critical Path schedule analysis to bring the project back on track. But it's not quite as simple as that. You see, because Earned Value metrics cannot be relied on once the project is around 2/3 complete, you will find that the Critical Path schedule analysis information differs from the metrics you're generating within Earned Value Management. And this is exactly where Earned Schedule comes into its own. You'll also note that the Earned Schedule concept has been added as an appendix to the Project Management Institute's practice standard for Earned Value Management. And anyone preparing for the Project Management Professional exam in 2018 and onwards will need to understand exactly what Earned Schedule is. So for the rest of this primer, I obviously want to focus on not just earned value management, but also earned schedule management. I'm assuming you're fairly familiar with critical path management, but it's likely that critical chain is something you've heard of and may not be that familiar with. So just briefly, before we proceed any further, I want to introduce to you critical chain management so you're aware of what its purpose is. Now, it was developed way back over 5 or 6 or 7 years ago by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt. The approach is an interesting one, and it's something which Dr. Goldratt came up with while developing his theory of constraints. And it looks something like this. You'll recognize immediately this is a simple network diagram showing tasks with durations connected in a certain way. It's a very simple project I've chosen here, with the start over the left-hand side and the finish over here. What Dr. Goldratt's approach was to include feeder buffers, project buffers and resource buffers, as I've shown here. And that might look on the face of it as if what he is doing is adding extra tasks, which is of course true, but it's the way in which they're used which makes this such an interesting and useful approach. You see, in estimating the tasks, they are assumed to be aggressive, or otherwise known as best case, rather than average or risk-free. You may be familiar with the various estimating techniques using best case, worst case and most likely case. When asking an individual for a duration, or more precisely the work effort needed to carry out a particular task, it's highly likely that human nature will step in and they'll give you either the worst case, which means it's going to take as long or as much work as possible, or they'll give you the average. And this, of course, tends to pad your schedule. Now, the way to get around that is, as I've said, is to use aggressive estimates. Lose any safety time, but this will be placed, this extra lost safety time, within the project and feeding buffers. The approach here is that these buffers are known and planned by the project manager, but not released to the team themselves, so that the duration of each of these tasks use the most aggressive estimates. So the estimates that are used here are best case. In other words, what would happen to task G if everything went perfectly, all of the resources were available, what's the quickest you can get it done in? And so in this case they come up with 4 weeks. The worst case, however, might include delays, resource problems, or the fact that the team don't have sufficient skills, and so on and so forth. But that's where the buffers play their part. Because by taking the best case, you can reduce on average the task durations by 50%, and you'll create your schedule on the latest finish dates. Now, my intention here isn't to go into any further details on critical chain. Just be aware that it uses these buffers where half of the duration taken away from the tasks are stored, if you will, within the buffers, almost as if the project manager has got this extra time and resources up their sleeve, which they'll use to eat into if any of these tasks start to differ from their aggressive best case estimates. If you want to find out more about critical chain, pop on over to our website. That's on www.projex.com, Projex spelled Projex, and check out our critical chain primer. Next up, I want to talk about and go a little further to these problems that the regular earned value method actually has. You see, the problem has created a lot of hassle when the EVM scheduling metrics, such as the Schedule Performance Index, known as SPI, and Schedule Variance, known as SV, are used. Don't worry, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the regular earned value metrics before we get into detail on earned schedule. But it's important you understand what the heart of the problem is. You see, if your critical path schedule that you've calculated from your network diagram shows that your project is behind schedule, your EVM schedule performance, because it's derived from cost information, may still indicate that you're ahead of schedule. Here's the mismatch that you can often find occur. So your project could be behind schedule, yet your SPI, that's your Schedule Performance Index, is showing apparently good schedule performance. And this, in a nutshell, is the Achilles heel of earned value as it currently exists. You may well know, and I shall remind you shortly, that the Schedule Performance Index if it's greater than 1 or if the schedule variance is less than 0, then less work is being completed than was planned, suggesting that you are behind schedule. So if SPI, for example, is 0.7, and by the same token, let's say that your schedule performance is showing a negative amount, then you're behind schedule. The reverse is also true, as you might have gathered. I won't go through it. It just merely means that you're now ahead of schedule if SPI is, say, 1.2, or that your schedule variance is showing $500. You see, there's the problem. Because earned value is based on cost, then your schedule variance will be shown as let's say, a dollar amount, rather than quoting a time. If SPI equals 1 exactly, or SV equals 0, this would suggest that the project is on schedule. However, as I've said already, an unfavourable SPI or SV does not necessarily mean a schedule slippage. And neither does a favourable SPI or SV necessarily indicate that you're doing well and you're actually ahead of schedule. The heart of this is that SV and SPI are not time-based indicators. They simply show whether less or more work has been accomplished than was originally planned. In other words, these are artificially transformed, if I can use that term, to come up with schedule-related data, even though they're derived from cost-based data. So, earned value method scheduling metrics are simply not reliable as towards the end of the project. Get up to halfway or 2/3 and they're just fine, and I'll show you exactly how this occurs later in this primer. EVM measures the schedule performance not in units of time but rather in cost, so that SPI and SV crucially are independent of what you've been calculating using the critical path approach. A schedule slippage can only be determined by evaluating the critical path network. Here I've shown you a snapshot of a Gantt chart with several tasks, some which are complete and some which are still work in progress. It's only by looking at this that you can get an unambiguous view of your schedule status and your forecast schedule metrics. Now it's time to introduce you to a gentleman called Walter Lipke, who is the genius that derived earned schedule way back in 2003. Walter, frankly, was a genius, and it is he that came up with earned schedule and has shown that earned schedule prediction is better than any other EVM method that's presently used. And as I've already made the point, the SV and SPI behave erratically for projects that are currently behind schedule. To understand exactly what Walter did, he used something called the interpolation formula, where you need to determine the time at which the earned value accrued should have occurred. You'll also need to be aware, from traditional earned value metrics, that when the actual completion is greater than the planned completion, then the schedule variance equals the budget at completion minus the budget at completion, which means schedule variance will equal $0 at the end of the project. Worse than that, then the schedule performance indicator will be budget at completion divided by budget completion, which equals 1. So it's quite natural, as a project nears completion, SV will gradually be getting closer to 0 and SPI will be gradually getting closer to 1, regardless of how late your project. And it's for this reason that schedule indicators based on EVM lose their predictive ability, certainly quite rapidly over the last third of the project. So let's look at this on a diagram so that these ideas can start to become real for you. You see, it's a fact of life that most times you will need to calculate earned schedule where the earned value is midway between a time point. Let me clarify that point right now. You'll be familiar with the diagram I'm showing you here. I've shown dollars in this case as the monetary value, although it could be any other currency. And here I'm showing some generic time periods. These could be weeks or months, quarters or what have you. What you'd expect to see once you create your project plan and get it approved, that there will be a planned value, or PV, generated in the form of a curve, often called an S-curve, simply because of its shallow S shape. So this is the cumulative value of planned value as it goes through to the end of your project, this being the dollar value in this case of your budget at completion. And each of these points along this continuum would be the planned value. In other words, the dollar value that was planned at that particular moment in time. For example, at the end of, let's imagine this is month 4, you could follow your eye up and then follow this across and see what the planned value was. Once you start carrying out the work, it's then that you can start to earn value, hence the term. And here you can see at the end of month 6, this is the earned value, and it's less than the actual monetary value you'd planned to have spent, which suggests already, if you're familiar with earned value, that you're behind schedule. However, I want to look at this from the perspective of earned schedule. So let me add some extra data here. Here's today's date, or as I want you to start remembering it as, actual time, or AT, showing here you are at the end of the 6th month, let's assume. What you'd want to do is to throw a line back from the point of earned value at today's date until it hits, or kisses if you will, the cumulative planned value point, and then throw a line down directly to the timeline, here showing about 4.5 months, if we assume that these units are months, for example. So even though you're at the end of month 6, your earned value is as you had originally planned to have accomplished. This should immediately tell you that you're behind schedule. But look at the difference here. We're not merely taking cost values and converting them into schedule. We're using real schedule values, which is the power of earned schedule. So as I've said back here, you'd normally expect to want to calculate your earned schedule at some midway point. After all, assume you're actually sending your boss a report every week or every 2 weeks. You'd have to work out what the earned schedule is partway through the end of month 4 and the end of month 5. So you need a generic formula in order to do this. So here I'll simply call this planned value of time point 4 and this planned value of time point 5, so that you can treat this generally rather than assuming they're months or weeks or some other unit. What you know then, from the beginning of the project up to the end of month 6, this time frame here is AT, in this case 6 units or 6 months, whereas this point here is your earned schedule. So what Walter did now was to create a generic formula for this. You know that this value here is your schedule variance. Notice it's now in time frame, not in the original EV cost units. So you can see directly just by observation that your project is currently about 1.5, let's say, months behind schedule. So how do we work out schedule variance in terms of time? Well, it's the value of ES, that's this amount here, in pure time units, minus the actual time in pure time units. If you want to find your schedule performance index in terms of time, then you simply divide the numeric amount of earned schedule, in this case about 4.5 months, by the actual time, in this case 6 months. Well, 4.5 divided by 6 comes out to about 0.75. Remember, SPI is dimensionless. It's simply a ratio. So what Walter Lipke did is he reminded himself about the general interpolation formula, where you can find some point midway between two known points. It's a simple piece of maths. In this case, it's this earned value point here minus PV4. So this is 4.5 minus PV4, which is 4, which gives you your half. I know it's blindingly obvious, but these numbers are often a lot more difficult in the real world. And then you divide that by PV5, in this case 5, subtracted from PV4, which is 4, giving you 1. So this will be 0.5 over 1, and then you add this to your last known point, which is PV4. So in this case, earned schedule equals the last known point, 4 plus this interpolation, which is 0.5, giving you 4.5. So this seems a rather long way to go about something that you could simply see in this example by observation. But believe me, when PV4 and PV5 are more messy than that, if you will, and this point here is some midpoint, then having this formula will be quite useful. We'll come back and reuse this in later lessons. But before I go any further, I really need to make sure that you're familiar with traditional earned value management. Now, what I won't do is take you through how to use earned value management, but I will just remind you of some of the basic EVM terms. In the accompanying workbook with this primer, you'll find I've captured all these at the end so that you could print that out as an easy reference. I won't go through these in detail. Budget at completion is how much budget was originally planned, usually given from the plan that you've created. Another metric you'd use is your planned value. You then have earned value, which represents how much work was actually completed at a particular point in time, and the actual cost. Indeed, these three key metrics are all you need in earned value to actually work out whether your project is overspending, underspending, going to come in late, or is going to come in early. So you'll then go on to generate in earned value management something called cost variance, showing the difference between what you expected to spend and what you're actually spending, and in a similar way, schedule variance, although this is derived from cost data, as I've made the point already. Then you have your two performance indexes. First of all, the cost performance index, which you can still use along with CV, since earned value management does a great job. It's only the schedule information that runs into problems when you get later into the project. And so you have schedule performance index also. You have estimate at completion, which is a projection showing what the total cost will be at completion, and then estimate to completion. In other words, from this point in time, how much more will be spent on the project based on your past performance. One more, you have something called variance at completion, showing the difference between what was originally budgeted and what will actually be spent. As I say, I'm not going to go through all these. I'm assuming you know a fair bit about them already. Then you have something called cumulative CPI. So for example, if you calculate these at the end of each month, what CPI cumulative means is the total CPI up to this point. And in a similar way, you have something called to complete performance index. This is in terms of costs, and you also have something called TCPI-S in terms of schedule. But as I've been at pains to show you already, the schedule versions of these are liable to show large errors once your project gets around 2/3 complete. So these last three slides have just been a reference for you to remind you about earned value metrics. On one final slide to finish off this first lesson, here's the sequence in which you would normally carry these out. The first thing you'd want to know during planning is to understand exactly how much will your project cost, and this is called budget at completion. You'll then want to know what your planned spend is. These are the steps along the time point up to budget at completion. At every single point in time, let's say once a week or once a month, you would calculate earned value, and this will tell you what you've actually earned rather than spent so far. What you've actually spent thus far is known as the actual cost, or AC. And what you'll now be able to compute is your cost variance, the difference between what you've actually spent and what you'd planned to spend at that point in time. Next up, you'll want to know what the difference is from planned schedule, and this is where you use your schedule variance, or SV. Having got that, you can now work out your cost performance index, which is a ratio. Assuming dollars as your currency, how much are we getting for every dollar spent? And then schedule performance index, SPI, how much are we progressing compared to the schedule plan? Then you can go on to forecast and say, based on what we know thus far, what's our estimate at completion, known as EAC? Further, from this moment on, therefore, how much more will we have to spend? And when we get there, what is the variance at completion from our original budget to what we now predict will be spent? And then we can go into our cumulative formula, in this case cumulative CPI. This factors in the performance efficiency over many time periods that you've been gathering earned value and making the other calculations. And in a similar way, to complete performance index, TCPI-C or TCPI-S. This shows the performance to be achieved based on the remaining work yet to be done in order to meet your cost and schedule goals. There's 13 key formulas that I've taken you through here. So there's a quick refresher on earned value itself, as well as giving you a brief introduction to earned schedule. Thanks for your time and attention. Do join me on lesson 2. when I'll give you an earned value review and go through a few of the calculations that I've covered here on an example project. So from me, Dave, it's bye for now.